Disrupting Japan, Episode 34. Welcome to Disrupting Japan, straight talk from Japan's most successful entrepreneurs. I'm Tim Romero, and thanks for listening. This is an experimental show, but an important one. You're going to hear a story today that does not have a happy ending. Well, actually it kind of does, but not in the way you'd expect. Startup culture has a very confused view of failure. We founders are simultaneously told to fail fast, but to never give up. People glibly spout that we should fail fast and fail forward, but actual failure, well, it's not that simple. It's not something that can just be shrugged away. Now, I've been to two well-known conferences that claim to promote an acceptance of failure. And at these conferences, a procession of people took the stage and told the audience about their failures. But not really. You see, they told stories of how they bravely turned around a bad situation or how they rebounded even stronger from a temporary setback. One of them even ended his story with him selling his company for $200 million. I only wish I could fail like that. But the stories were good. The audience enjoyed them. The event was a success, so who am I to criticize? But still, it made me wonder. Maybe people don't really want to hear about actual failure. Maybe we only really want to hear about successful failures. Everyone loves a happy ending. But you know, that's not what failure is like. I've had successful exits, but I've also bankrupted companies. And you know something? Failure hurts. Failure is lonely. Some people who you thought were close friends stop returning your calls. Failure is where you see both the absolute worst and sometimes the absolute best in both yourself and in the people around you. Now, failure's not to be celebrated. Failure's to be accepted, to be studied, but not celebrated. And today I'm honored to sit down with Hiroshi Nagashima and hear a story about a startup gone wrong. Now, as the story unfolds, more experienced listeners will see the yellow flags and then the red flags start to appear. But what I'm most grateful to Hiro for is sharing not simply the strategic and situational reasons that his business went bad, but what it really feels like to have your company fall apart around you. It's a great story with no cliches, no feel-good rationalizations, and absolutely no bullshit. It's a story not of happy endings, but perhaps one of redemption. So let's get right to the interview. All right, I'm sitting here with Hiro Nagashima of Sharebu Kids. Thanks for sitting down with us.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
All right, I'm delighted. Now, Sharebu Kids was an online retailer of high-end fashion for babies and kids, and
Yes.
seem to be mostly overseas brands.
Yes, that's right.
You can probably explain it much better than I can. So what was Sharebu Kids?
Yes, well, Sharebu Kids started out in 2012. Actually, the initial concept came out of one of the investors, Casey Wall.
Right.
He wanted to do something with baby and children's clothes. And I got together with him and to try to think of an actual plan, how to create this company and how the business model would be. You know, he pointed out a very, very interesting aspect of the fashion business. There was really no flash sales in Japan.
Right.
At the time, there were flash sales for adult clothes, such as the Gilt Group or a Brand for Friends.
So this was a company that very much you were building a company around a good business opportunity.
Business idea, really. That just kind of was just an idea at first, and I really tried to develop this idea.
In a sense, that makes sense because you yourself are coming from a really strong background in finance. So you've got an MBA from Wharton, you've worked at Mitsubishi and Bloomberg. Mm-hmm. So I can see why that financial angle would be appealing to you. But what made you want to leave a solid career in finance and go start a company?
Well, actually, before starting Shrebu Kids, I actually worked in another startup. That's a company called Lacondo.
Was that a rocket internet company?
That's exactly right.
I know those guys.
So the reason why I got started with that is because of my background in finance, and they had contacted my school, and through the school, they contacted me about starting, and so they wanted to create a team, and it was very interesting to me. So it was a great experience. The company didn't go as we planned.
No, there was a lot of turnover there, as I recall.
Yes, there was, and I was one of the ones who turned over, really. But it was a great experience. I mean, I was one of the founding members, one of the 6 starting members of the company, and I built the operations for that company. I learned a lot of new things in e-commerce, and after I kind of stepped out of Locondo, I really wanted to continue on that path of building companies. Starting Shrebu Kids was, it was my company.
Were your friends and family supportive of this move to entrepreneurship?
They were, and in some ways they are still. They know what I wanted to do. They kind of understand that I'm sort of an ambitious guy within the family. I'm Japanese, and my parents, of course, are from a Japanese background. But I would say maybe, they're not the typical conservative, like Japanese family. I mean, they were very supportive of me since I was little.
Oh, that's great. I mean, so many of the founders I talk to, when they first go out on their own, there's tremendous pressure from inside the family to not do that.
Yeah, to conform to maybe societal norms.
Especially if they're leaving a really good job, right?
Yeah.
So, Shrebu Kids, you had what seemed like a solid business plan, a attractive market opportunity.
Yes.
Tell me about the launch and early traction.
We try to focus on the children and kids clothing marketing flash sales. We approached many of the Japanese domestic baby clothes manufacturers, the brands. And it turned out that they were very conservative, that they didn't want to just give the products to us to sell on consignment. Especially, because, we were very, startup-y, like we weren't very well funded. That didn't attract a lot of the Japanese brands. So what happened was, after exhausting our contacts with the Japanese brands, we decided to make a pivot of trying to get foreign brands to sell in Japan, but they were not on consignment. They were actually purchased.
Oh, okay. So you were having inventory. You were having to maintain inventory.
Exactly. But the model there is that we wouldn't sell the extremely famous brands in Japan. Mm-hmm. We would sell some of the companies that were kind of moderately well known, but they didn't have distributors in Japan.
You were selling foreign brands that didn't have a presence here in Japan yet, right? You weren't selling...
They were little known, so they were kind of up-and-coming brands, and this is what we try to focus on.
Okay, so brands that might be getting a little bit of traction, but are desperate enough for new revenues to take a chance on a startup.
Exactly.
Sounds like a solid approach.
Yes. Ultimately, for any retailer, if you have a customer base, that's always attractive to manufacturers or brands. So this was really the entry.
So you started building up a customer base with the foreign brands.
Yes.
After you had this customer base, were the domestic manufacturers more willing to work with you?
Yes. When we first initially approached them, we didn't even have a website. But after we launched it with the foreign brands, they actually liked their site. I mean, it was very upscale. It was very different from what the Japanese brands were used to. So we went back to some of these brands, and they were interested. I mean, I would say they definitely had more interest in giving us the clothes, except they said, okay, we will provide these clothes to you, but you will have to buy this at this price. But it was very low. I mean, it was a good deal. But even at that point, we just didn't have enough funding to put all our money into that one brand.
Into inventory, yeah,
yes.
Yeah. But it sounds like things are, other than the inventory risk, that things are going along well. Your sales were increasing at this point.
Yes.
You were hiring staff.
Yes.
So when did things start to
unravel, basically?
Yeah, well, really? Okay. Well, even before that, when did you start to get the feeling that things weren't going well?
When I tried to go get additional funding to grow the business. I attracted some VCs, It's what I realized later on was, they showed a lot of interest. They showed a lot of interest in my background and what the company could be. But retailing is such a risk for VCs, especially when you're doing it not on consignment, but when you're buying when you're buying inventory. So that's very risky to them. And I think I got the feeling that with the VCs that I approached, they would rather invest when the company was much bigger. So it almost felt like there wasn't funding for that series that I was very interested in.
Were the VCs up front with you? Did they tell you that? Or did they just say, let's keep talking?
One VC specifically said that they would rather invest in a later round.
Okay.
One VC wasn't so straightforward. They just said they would have to see much higher projections. I think that's one of the mistakes that I made as well, is that when I actually approached them, maybe I wasn't as optimistic about the figures, and they were really looking for that kind of mega hit investment.
So you think you were just too conservative?
Yes, I think that's definitely one of the mistakes.
Probably your finance background working against you.
Maybe so. But I think that's one of the lessons that kind of came out, was maybe I had made too conservative projection, and that didn't really in turn convince the VCs that this was
a serious possibility.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah, that could make sense, just because they're so used to hearing founders give ridiculous projections.
Exactly.
They'll cut anything you say in half before thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, so after you got this feedback from the VCs, so you realized that the round was not going to close as you expected, when you expected. How did you change your business? How did you take this new information and use it?
To grow the business exponentially, I needed a lot of money. But at that point, the sales were still going up. My idea was that, we would do kind of a slow ramp up of the business, just kind of hiring people as the sales went up incrementally.
Your burn rate must have been very low at this point.
Very low, very low.
So you were almost a cash flow positive, growing the company.
Exactly.
By normal measures, you're doing everything right.
Yeah. Basically, I wasn't really paying myself, and I just had one full-time staff, and the rest of the part-timers, this would be marketing, part-time buying, photography of the products, photoshopping. These people were all part-timers, and many of them are people I actually got to know or worked for me at Laconda, the previous company.
From my own experience with part-timers, I've found they're often, let's say, not as committed to the success of the company, but it sounds like you didn't experience that at all.
Actually, with some people I did, but most of the part-timers that I brought in were people I already knew and I had worked with or had worked for me.
So there was a personal commitment there.
It was a personal commitment.
All right. So you decided to kind of stay the course, grow organically, cover your costs.
Yes.
Sounds like you're certainly on a reasonable path now.
Yes.
So how did this play out?
When we initially started Shirabu Kids, we started importing clothes from overseas, and at that time, the yen was relatively strong. It was probably 80 yen to the dollar.
Oh yeah.
And then it started going bad when the yen rate what became about 115 or 120 yen to the dollar.
Right. It's about 120 now.
That became very serious for the company because it just cut into the margins, and we realized that of course we tried raising the price. I would say most items just didn't stick with the consumers. So it was just really decreasing gross margins. And that didn't allow us to really cover the cost that we were able to before. And it was becoming bad. And so early 2014, I had to let go of my only full-time staff. And I kind of really stepped into that role. So I was the only full-time person just doing the marketing, the buying, the fulfillment.
Employees know when things are going wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, for me anyway, that was harder to deal with than the financial aspects of it. So what was the team like at this point? Were they still putting in the hours? What was going on?
The part-timers, they mostly work from home, so they didn't really know about the situation.
So at this point, I mean, you're still keeping on and you're still focused.
Yes.
And your family and friends who were supportive early on, did they know what was going on, or was it pretty much you kept it to yourself?
The part-timers didn't know. A lot of my friends I didn't tell. I mean, my parents sort of knew. My girlfriend knew. But of course the investors knew. But it was pretty much limited to that. I mean, I didn't try to, put on. I was always serious. But I didn't try to,
So you were trying to keep a public persona that everything is fine and business as usual.
And I, up until the very last minute, I believed that it was going to succeed.
Yeah.
So I kept on.
What happened at this point? I mean, you're filling the role of 2 startup employees, which is like 4 normal employees.
Right.
That had to be taking its toll on you.
The one thing that was good for me was that in terms of cost, like office space, I was able to use my investors' office space, and I wasn't charged for that.
Okay.
Also, what happened was I kind of doubled that office space as my apartment, really.
Oh no. So you're sleeping at the office?
Yeah, I mean, I would wake up early and work until very late, trying to get everything done. So it was tough.
So revenues at this point are shrinking, or still going up?
Just very flat.
Flat.
Very flat, but the gross margins are getting worse.
Okay.
So at this point, 2014, I scraped together whatever money I could get. Some of the money I actually liquidated. Some of my, I had worked in the United States, so I had a 401k savings, and I had to cash out on that to fund the business.
So you were really putting everything you had into this. I mean, every sense of the word.
Yes.
Wow. I guess at this point, you're sleeping in the office. You've put everything you have financially into the company again. You're probably destroying your health at this point.
From eating unhealthy breads and noodles.
And you're playing a game of mostly cost control at this point, I would guess, right?
Yes.
For me, looking at this from the outside, it's easy to say, okay, this is an unsustainable situation. Obviously, you didn't think so, or you wouldn't have kept going. So what was that trigger that made you say, okay, I'm done with this?
The time I really knew that the business can't go forward is basically the money just ran out. It wasn't a self-sustaining business. I mean, I needed more cash to just even keep the sales going flat. I wasn't paying myself, so that kind of personal debt also piles on. Yeah. And it was just kind of spiraling out of control. And that's just when I knew, I mean, at this point, unless I got funding, and I don't mean a little money, big money, it just wasn't going to go on.
So it wasn't so much a rational decision as reality just kind of hitting you in the face and saying, you're done, you're out of money.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it was just basically that. It was just almost filing for personal bankruptcy, or, It was just that kind of a moment. Personality-wise, I'm not the one to quit on anything. So I just found it, once I got going, I just found it hard to stop. And
you were just focused on that goal.
Yeah, and at this point, I mean, I remember there was a time when my father said, maybe, this is time to stop. But it's just like not something I was willing to accept, Wow. I just felt like I had to go on. Basically, maybe I couldn't take the fact that everything, all the cost or all the money that I put in would be a sunk cost. But maybe I just couldn't face up to that. So maybe there was.
You think maybe you just didn't want to admit it to yourself? Or?
At that point, maybe there was a little bit of that. Maybe I was a bit delusional, and maybe not wanting to accept the fact that it would go under, because, what else would I do, really? I mean, I've been at it for so long, and, how would I go about folding a company?
At this point, what did you think shutting down the company was going to be like? I mean, you had to have an image in your head of what you thought it was going to be like. And
I think that the thing that I imagine the most is, what kind of conversation would I have with the people who have supported me all this time, which is not just family members and my girlfriend or friends, but really also all the stakeholders, which is the investors as well, and also all the part-timers. At the end of the day, it's my responsibility. So I just found trying to have that conversation very tough to imagine.
You were feeling like you'd be letting a lot of people down?
Exactly. I think that was what worried me the most.
Yeah. What was it really like that day or that week when you finally had to pull the plug and shut it down for real?
I remember talking to my family. It wasn't so tough because maybe they thought maybe I should walk away from it. But I remember talking to my investor, and that was a very tough day. Because when you have an equity investor, if the company goes under, he just loses whatever stake he had in that company, and I know it's my responsibility, and that was
shutting it down was mostly meeting with the stakeholders at that point, talking to the part-timers.
Yeah, and letting know what was going to happen, going forward, and how that process would be, talking over.
Well, how did it go over? I mean, you were worried about talking to the stakeholders, and your family kind of has to accept you no matter what.
Yeah.
But how did these conversations go? I mean,
I'm not very good, as one would imagine. Following that initial conversation, we had some difficult conversations about, how we would exit and how I would get rid of some of the remaining inventory and so on and so forth.
Investors, and I know investors come in all shapes, sizes, and levels of experience, but startup investors are supposed to be grown up enough to know that they're probably going to lose any particular investment they make. So was the stress that your investors actually felt disappointed that you didn't generate a return?
I felt my investor was very understanding.
Okay.
And I knew it wouldn't be a terrible conversation because I had worked with him for a few years in the same office. But it's just that the feeling that I knew that I would be letting him down and was kind of a burden on me.
Okay, so it wasn't that your investors or stakeholders were acting unusual. It was more still your feeling of letting people down.
That was bigger. I mean, of course, with the investors, we had some difficult conversations, but it was within what I had expected. It wasn't anything crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what about from your wider circle of friends and things? Because I understand, like,
they didn't really give me feedback, and I just really told them I was no longer working on it. I had shut the site down, and maybe they felt like, oh, I told you so, or I knew it wouldn't work out, but I didn't really get any feedback. They
kind of kept it to themselves.
Yeah, because I think they knew that it was difficult for me, so I think they just didn't really comment on it.
Huh. Well, it sounds like even in Japan, where failure still does have this stigma. I mean, from what I'm hearing anyway, it sounds like you were harder on yourself than anybody else was.
Maybe.
I mean, it sounds to me like your investors and your friends and your family were more than willing to accept this failure and have you move on and be supportive, but you were the one beating up yourself.
Yeah, because I think this is just how I was maybe trained or brought up. Because startups fail every day, probably all over the world. But I think my belief is that as the owner or as the main person, you have to make sure that you put in everything you have into it, or else it's just not going to succeed. Yeah. So really, I wanted to do my part to make sure that I overcome these obstacles if I can. And then maybe the company would go well. But I felt that if I didn't put in that effort, of course it's not going to go well.
Right. So what's next?
What I decided to do after Shared Kids was, reality really set in after that. I just needed to find a job. I mean, in terms of like personal standpoint, I needed to just earn money, even if it's month to month.
Now, this is a really important point in Japan right now. So during the job interview process, and particularly if you're dealing with established companies, did you feel there was any kind of a stigma?
I did.
Did you?
It was so interesting, this whole process, because there was a lot of, I started looking for opportunities at that time, and I would think even now, there's a lot of opportunities in e-commerce. I mean, it's in Japan, there's so many jobs, and I'm grateful for the experience that I've had and some of my educational background, that I was able to get a lot of interviews with a lot of companies. But what happened during the interview is a different story. I would tell them about my experience in e-commerce, and basically I have not had an experience where I took a company and made it into a gazillion-dollar company.
Right.
And this is what everybody was expecting. I mean, they didn't, I think in America, they see failure in a startup as something that would be beneficial to a company, your next company.
Sure. It's not as good as success, but it's real experience.
It's real experience, and you learn what not to do maybe. But a lot of the people I spoke to when I was interviewing here in Japan, most people didn't see it that way. It was like, well, if you have not succeeded, then what can you do here? And that was kind of the problem that I had.
So were these companies, you don't have to name names, but were they large traditional companies? Were they newer startups? What types of firms were you interviewing with?
I was interviewing with large multinational companies. I mean, some were domestic companies, but fairly well known, and some US companies, like Fortune 500 companies, that were looking to put a lot of effort into their e-commerce.
Okay.
But it was just really odd that I would go into a lot of these interviews, and I had gotten many, but it just didn't have that good result.
It wasn't the lack of e-commerce knowledge, it was the fact that you failed. They brought this up in the interviews, and really...
And I don't know.
I'm sorry to hear. I mean, that's one of the things that needs to change here in Japan.
And it was interesting because, some of the multinational companies, you would think they're much more willing to accept those kind of people. But in reality, if you talk to maybe some of the hiring officers or the HR people,
because they're all Japanese,
exactly, and that's the kind of mentality they have as well. I mean, it's like, if you have failed, what else? What can you do for us? And that's the kind of hurdle I couldn't overcome. So essentially, I felt that I almost had to not lie, but just kind of embellish a lot of things.
All right,
but that still didn't really work too much.
So you think that they would prefer a less skilled, less knowledgeable person who's had less responsibility and therefore hasn't failed?
Yeah, maybe somebody who took less risk, but maybe somebody who had a lot of potential to succeed. I think those were maybe the kind of people they were looking for.
I was really hoping you weren't going to say that.
Oh, really?
No. I mean, it's the truth. That's what I want. I just meant for like the future of Japan.
Oh, okay.
I was hoping that wasn't still the case.
Oh, okay.
Everyone in Japan these days is saying that they're more accepting of failure and that it's embracing, but having lived through it, it sounds like that's not really the case yet.
Yes, but I wouldn't say that all is lost, because I actually found an opportunity with a Japanese company who sell British luxury goods.
Okay.
I met with the CEO of that company, and that person really found my experience interesting. And I remember during the interview, he asked me, if you had to do it all over again, would you do it? And I think that was the key question. And I said, yes, absolutely, I would do it again. Consequently, he hired me, and I'm managing the e-commerce for that company.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And so I'm extremely grateful to that person.
Was he the founder of that company?
He was the founder of that company.
See, this is what I've found. Is everyone says that entrepreneurs can't work for other people. I don't believe this. Entrepreneurs can work for other entrepreneurs. That usually works out really well.
I think so. And maybe, that's, probably true for a lot of people who do startups and end up like me. Maybe temporarily they need to go back into a corporate job. But I think if you spend the time, you can find opportunities. It's just that, there's just, at this point in Japan, not many.
You have to work for it.
You have to really work for it and find them.
Well, the CEO already asked you the question I was going to, whether you would do it again.
Yes.
Let me ask you, if you could go back in time and do it again, what would you do differently this time?
I think before spending the money, before pivoting, I would have made sure that the business model, because initially we tried to do a flash sales, and I would have made sure that would have really that I would have been able to follow through with the business with that model, because we pivoted way too early.
So do you mean you should have stuck with it longer, or you should have tested it on a smaller scale? What would you have done?
I would have gone to all the manufacturers and made sure what they wanted to do the flash sales. And I would have adjusted my spending or talking with the VCs accordingly. Because I started out with the company and we made a small pivot and we tried to do like, oh, maybe if we spend a little money, we'll see how it goes. And it was kind of an incremental like increase in sales of the business. Instead of doing that, if I had known I would have done the business model, I would have made sure that I had thought of that business model well before starting and made all the projections and would have approached the VCs with a lot more funding. Getting funding is great, but spending that money little by little doesn't always...
So you would have done fewer tiny experiments and spent more time on like customer validation and...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Up front, and then I would have made my projections much higher, and then I would have been able to approach the VCs with those kind of projections as opposed to doing this kind of slow, kind of incremental rise in sales.
Where all the VCs want to see that exponential growth.
Yeah. So in a sense, it's like I would have spent my money much faster.
All right.
Really.
But hopefully gotten more of it.
Yeah, exactly. When we made that pivot, you're a little scared that maybe that business model isn't going to pan out. So that's why you spend in little bits and pieces of it. But that doesn't work. That didn't work out for me. And I see for a lot of my fellow entrepreneurs that a lot of people who have succeeded and gotten funding, they spend that money very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the mistakes that I made. So I would do that differently.
So get certain on your strategy first, and then
just
put the money behind it.
Yeah, and just do it. And then early on, then you would know if you had a good business model or not. Whereas I kind of tinker around with it for 2-3 years.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about the difficulties. We've talked a lot about the hard times you went through in this. But looking back on it now, what do you look back on most fondly?
Most fondly?
Yeah.
I don't know if I would say looking back on it fondly. The number one thing that I got most out of it was it kind of built me up as a person. You face so much in a startup. I mean, so many things don't go well.
Oh, yeah.
But you just need to have that focus. You need to have that kind of resolve. And that's what I gained most out of it. Because when I used to work for a company, you freak out at the smallest things, like, oh, this didn't go well. But now it's like those things don't bother me, because the things that I worried about with this startup was like, oh my God, what if I can't pay my employees? I mean, payday's coming up and I don't have the cash.
It does give you a sense of priorities, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
It gives you a real sense of perspective.
Yeah, and after experiencing that, a lot of the things that I used to fuss about aren't such a big deal anymore. And so it's given me so much of that resolve, like as a person. And so I look, I don't know, fondly, but appreciative.
On that?
Yes.
Excellent. You think you'll do it again?
Oh, definitely. I think I would at some point. I don't know if I would just cleanly quit my company and work on a new startup, but...
It sounds like you need a little time to decompress.
Exactly, and get my finances in order as well.
A salary can be really helpful there.
Yes, but I have these thoughts because maybe, deep down, maybe I am an entrepreneur. Like,
I want to really thank you for coming and sharing your story. But before we wrap up, what advice do you have for all the young Japanese who want to start companies?
My number one advice is I think there's only so much that you can think through the business model that you're thinking about, your own startup. But once you've done that to a certain extent, just go into it. Because there's so many things that come up that you can't predict and you have to solve on your own. So just go into it. Because if you don't go into it, it's never going to start. Because I know so many people who say, oh, I want to do my own business, I want to start this, I want to start that. But for most people, it just never happens. Because I think a lot of it is just that courage part. And I know this very well but by doing this startup, I just kind of put myself there and I just exposed myself. Yeah. And a lot of crappy things happened to me, but I'm still here and I survived. And at the end of the day, hey, I'm not dead, My family is still intact, my loved ones are still there for me. And that's all you can really expect in life.
Excellent. Well, listen, man, thanks so much for coming. I mean, everyone talks about failure in the abstract or loves talking about other people's failures, but I think it takes real guts to talk about your own.
So thank you for having me. I really enjoyed talking about my experience.
Thanks for coming in.
It's been a great time. Thank you.
And we're back. I've got to say, I was disappointed at how hard it was for Hiro to find a new job after his company went bankrupt. That's one of the most important things we need to get fixed in Japan before startups will really begin to flourish. Now, startup culture teaches us to treat failure so lightly that it almost trivializes it, but I disagree. Now, some of my friends in San Francisco feel I put too much concern on failure, and perhaps they're right, but I don't think so. You can't put your heart, your time, your life, your relationships into something and then just shrug it off if it blows up around you. You get over it. You learn from it. You move on. Someday you might actually laugh at it. But I think if failure doesn't hurt, your heart wasn't in it. You weren't really trying. Being an entrepreneur is not so much about not being afraid of failure, but being afraid and doing it anyway. If you've got an honest failure story you want to share, we'd love to hear from you. Come by disruptingjapan.com/show034 and tell us about it, or drop by the Disrupting Japan Facebook page. When you drop by the site, you'll see the links and sites that Hiro and I talked about, and much, much more in the resources section of the post. And if you get a chance, please leave us an honest review on iTunes. It's really the best way you can support the show and help us get the word out. But most of all, thanks for listening. And thank you for letting people interested in Japanese startups know about the show. I'm Tim Romero, and thanks for listening to Disrupting Japan.